I think the role of the CSO is continue to be a calm voice amongst perhaps what might be global divergence on this topic. And we are starting to see a geographic divergence, at least from a political leadership point of view, is to be very calm in the face of what is likely to be somewhat chaotic as all these chess pieces move around the political world.
Hello and welcome to the CSO Impact Podcast, where we talk to leaders in sustainability and how work can be positive for the planet and our future. I have the pleasure to welcome Marisa Drew. She's a Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered, and she's also one of our top 100 CSOs from the CSO Awards, which we held in Davos in January this year. So welcome, Marisa. How are you today?
I am very well, thank you. I can't say the sun is shining here in London, but at least everything's in bloom, so we're having a good day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we want to learn a little bit more about your role as a CSO and your company. And why don't we start first with a quick introduction about Standard Chartered? What is the mission? What are you doing in financial services?
Sure, with pleasure. So Standard Chartered is an organization of almost 85,000 people, and a very long-standing bank that had its heritage in trade, so helping to move goods and services and capital across borders. And that heritage very much informs even today what we do 150 years later. Our footprint is therefore very focused on the developing economies. So we operate in some 52 footprint markets with a heavy emphasis on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Even though we are a global organization, that we often say the beating heart print of our footprint is these developing markets. And something that informs us as well is very much this desire that we want to help our markets thrive and prosper. And if we take a sustainability lens on that, one of our taglines, if you will, of a brand promise, which runs deeply in the DNA of the bank, is a tagline that says, here for good. And there's a double entendre there. Here for good as in longevity. We've been in many of these markets over 150 years, but also here for good to deliver something positive back to our communities and our clients and the places that we operate.
Fantastic. So I think there's one indicator that you have been around and your company are, let's say, on the forefront of a lot of things, because your domain is just sc.com. And so that means one of the first 2 weeks of when the internet was born, the bank says, okay, we're in. So maybe is that an indicator that there's some innovation at play throughout the organization as well?
Harald, I'm so glad you brought up innovation, because innovation is a passion of mine. And I think it's absolutely critical in sustainability that we look at systems with a much more innovative mind, because I think maybe what the world is telling us is some of the existing systems and the way we've operated in the past isn't necessarily future-proofing us. And therefore, we're in this moment, particularly if you think about it in the context of the energy transition or the global transition to sustainability, we are trying to transition the way we've done things for the last several decades in every industry, across every asset class, across every geography, all at the same time. No one's ever done anything like this before. So we do have to think very differently about our systems, about financial structures, about where we deploy capital and so on. And so that's a little bit of a personal mission of mine as a CSO in markets where, in some respects, the developing world, there is no book that's been written. So we aren't trying to transform legacy infrastructure. We can actually deploy these sustainable solutions, at the outset. And so in my organization, we have set up a series of innovation hubs, and we can go into those in more detail as you wish, around core themes that we think need a fair bit of innovative thinking, different ways of partnering with people and so on, in order to be able to deliver scale capital.
Love to dive into that as well. Maybe just as a frame of reference. So what do you think are some of the biggest, let's say, challenges for banking and financial services? Because your personal footprint as a bank is probably not so much. You are in buildings, sitting in front of computer, and so your own energy consumption is one topic. But the deployment of capital, I guess, is where the topic is. Can you maybe run around a couple of the challenges of the industry and maybe how Standard Chartered is addressing some of these?
Sure, with pleasure. If you look at this perhaps through the lens of carbon emissions for a bank, and you think about your scope emissions, in our case, and I would suspect it's very much the case in almost every bank, your emissions are largely resident in the businesses that you're doing for clients. So our scope 3 emissions are 99% of our total emissions profile. And of that, virtually all of it is scope 3 financed emissions, so our lending book. Yeah. And so as a bank, we provide capital, we lend capital, we underwrite capital. And the deployment of that capital is what we're talking here. And this is challenging because the way we're deploying capital with a sustainability overlay is working with our clients to help them transition to more sustainable options. If we look at the 12 hardest to abate sectors as defined by the Net Zero Banking Alliance, whether that's oil and gas or coal or steel or shipping, these are very, very complex journeys and they take time. So the biggest challenge that we have is this sense of urgency that we all have in the sustainability community to quickly move, get it done faster because we feel that pressure of time and what the climate is telling us. On the other hand, these embedded systems, you cannot just shut them off overnight. You can't shut coal off overnight. You put, half the world out of power. And energy and heat and light. So there has to be a sensible real world timetable that is driving toward an outcome. And by the way, it's not just timetables, it's real need for capital to help transition. We're going to need to raise hundreds of billions and trillions of capital to finance the energy transition. And it's happening, but that is the process. And so I'd say the biggest challenge today is really marrying up the ambition with the complexity of the execution.
And it's a hot topic, of course, with hard to abate sectors or fossil fuel industries. And is there, let's say, a mission where you say at one point you're going out of these industries, or are you helping them until the very end? There are some banks, Handelsbanken, for example, in Sweden, I think they're out of that industry. And I know it's hard to kick off business, but is there an official view on how long this transition is for your institution?
Yeah, much of this is resident also in the geographic footprint in which you operate. What is actually available, and in some cases, there just isn't the infrastructure to do it tomorrow. As I say, that's what I mean by the complexity of this. Yeah. I would take a market like, say, Indonesia. It's a coal-dependent economy, and it's a very, very complex geographic topography. There are archipelagos. Some are good for wind, some will work with solar, some hydro. There isn't a one-size-fits-all for this country as it looks to decarbonize. And you've got to fund the infrastructure. Massive transitional change. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are employed in those traditional industries. How do you transition them alongside the actual physical infrastructure challenge? So that's why I say it's very difficult when you operate in the markets that we operate in to put a set date on things. The other very important point is that our belief is that the best role that we can play is helping our clients through the transition by funding those journeys, because one could just say, I don't bank those companies. But then what? I have no influence to help them change. They won't act for me or work with me if I've said, you're no longer my client. Why would they bank with me? And so then my capital has no influence. So this is a complex topic, but my view and our bank's view is we very much want to be the partner to our clients to help them transition. And there is power with your balance sheet to nudge in the right direction and to find those mission-aligned clients. So we've committed to net zero. We have a target pathway for all of the hard-to-abate sectors with 2030 interim targets, and then ultimately, 2050 net zero. And we look at that very, very carefully every day about the business that we do and don't do. But if our clients are along the journey with us, then we're all heading down that pathway for each of those sectors down toward net zero.
So circling back to your innovation hubs, so how does maybe innovation come into some of these transitions, or what are other innovation topics that you're looking at right now?
So we can look at innovation through two lenses. One is the technological innovation, which is going to be needed for many of these hard-to-abate sectors. So what is the unlock for, say, the shipping industry? In some respects, you would argue that it is going to be a different type of fuel, right, that'll power those ships, or aviation, sustainable aviation fuel. That's a technological unlock in some respects. And when those technologies are able to be scaled and utilized, and when you get to scale, then you get to scale economics, so it actually is commercially viable, then you implement those. But I'm thinking some respects of my innovation hubs as innovation in a slightly different way. Rather than the technological innovation, it is systems thinking innovation. So I can give you an example. One of our innovation hubs is adaptation finance. Today, more than 80% of all climate finance has gone to mitigation, rightfully so. It's reducing carbon emissions to reduce global warming. On the other hand, no matter what we do, the fact of the matter is climate change is accelerating, and the effects of climate change, which are hitting businesses and our markets, and very much disproportionately so in the developing world, where in some cases their entire economies may depend on something like agriculture. And agriculture in many cases is under threat. Global warming is hitting the ability to produce crops, or pest infestation, or lack of water, or whatever these issues are. And so our belief is that we are going to need to galvanize alongside mitigation hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars to invest in adapting our markets, our businesses, our systems to climate change, and creating resiliency in those systems. Historically, that wasn't a place where the private sector operated to any material degree. It was viewed as almost disaster recovery. When an event happens, maybe the insurance company comes in, or the insurance market, or governments. But actually, there's a real opportunity for the private sector to play by building in and allocating capital toward resilient business models. It can be the built environment, building differently. It can be infrastructure development that's more resistant, and so on. This is a market that just, as a definitional matter, didn't exist 18 months ago. We did a fair bit of research on this, and we've been trying to define the market for the private sector to attract capital and to think about what are those use cases for commercial return. This is not, charitable organization or civil society kind of returns. This is commercial capital. And if you look at it through that lens, you can see that there's an enormous amount of opportunity to invest in, and it's necessary. So you put returns with necessity, and you see real values created. So that's an example of systems level thinking innovation that really hasn't existed, and we're on a mission to try to see if we can't collaborate with other financial actors to raise capital at scale in adaptation.
Fantastic and fascinating. I have another topic I want to talk to just about some of the initiatives you're driving, or some of the beliefs. And I had the privilege to see you last year in Lisbon during an ocean summit. I think it was last year, or not 2 years ago, but I think it was last year. And it was a fantastic panel with another bank. And you were talking about biodiversity and oceans and seagrass and so on and so forth. And I know that is a hot topic. How do we get, we talk about climate and carbon credits and so on, but now nature, biodiversity is sort of these, there was this picture with COVID as one wave, and the carbon credits and nature and biodiversity loss. What does a bank has to do with nature? Tell us a little bit about, because I think you are passionate about this topic. I want to bring this up.
I'm very passionate about this. Yes, and it won't surprise you to know that one of my innovation hubs is a nature innovation hub, and the hub is very focused on how do we bring again capital toward nature, toward nature positive outcomes. And once again, this is not terribly familiar territory for a bank. Way back when, in my old life, I hired, I think, the first head of nature in a bank, and that was an anathema. That was a very strange thing. People were trying to figure out what is she doing here. But I could see very clearly that we need the private sector to participate in nature positive outcomes. There is not enough government money in the world to spend and to help protect and conserve nature, but also to think about nature as an economy And again, this is not something the private sector thought about. For instance, oceans. We put this idea in collaboration with others. It wasn't just us, but the idea of the blue economy, working with the UN and World Economic Forum and others to say if you look at oceans, for instance, in GDP terms, it's somewhere around the 7th, 8th largest GDP in the world. And framing it in a way that people think, okay, actually, if it's an economic activity, it's investable. And then we set about trying to identify what are investable categories in the ocean, from aquaculture to marine transport to offshore wind and solar, again, framing it in a way that the private sector can comprehend. And then in addition to that, we've been focusing on novel financial structures which could attract capital into nature. And a successful endeavor in that respect was what is emerging as almost an asset class, our debt for nature swaps. So taking the stressed debts of countries who are very reliant on oceans for their economy and for their job creation in their islands, is to agree to restructure those debts under the condition that a portion of the restructured finance was allocated and ring-fenced, held aside in an endowment for nature. And that's how you marry the private sector with conservation investment, which ultimately ends up being, as we call it, that positive virtuous circle of a win-win, because the more that ocean conservation received capital in islands, the more it feeds the GDP. So it brings back fishing stocks, and it helps to think about the cleanliness of beaches and not putting effluent into the oceans and so on. And then it attracts tourism, and it just becomes this incredible, wonderful outcome of everybody wins by investing in nature. So, and we carry on. There are many more financial structures that we're working on, which think quite differently than in the past in order to be able to galvanize capital in that direction. And this is a very big year for the oceans. This is the UN Oceans Conference is coming in Monaco and Nice in June. It'll be a massive convening of those players who are very committed to addressing this topic, because the oceans play such a crucial role in everything from carbon sequestration and mitigating global warming through to feeding the planet. And it's not terribly well understood on a global level how critical the oceans are to planetary and human health. And that topic needs to be more prominent, and more capital needs to come, more scientific analysis to be able to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So this whole kind of partnership construct of all these actors coming together it's a very important moment for all of us coming this year.
And can you maybe you're probably familiar with the one case in the Bahamas. So I just heard, okay, there's seagrass around the Bahamas, the island. Somebody invests 150 million, but it's like all underwater. You don't see it. Nothing, is for the normal eye visible, but you get interest. I don't know, 8% or something like that. And the island government basically, let's say, benefits from it. Can you take either this case or a similar case? How can you finance something that you cannot see?
So this is where we must partner in some ways with those who are not your typical partners of a bank. So what I mean by that is, in these financial structures that we've been able to create around oceans and debt for nature swaps, like in the case of the Bahamas, we've partnered with NGOs who are those conservationists who've acted and worked very successfully on the ground and in the ocean. And they are really the experts. We can raise capital, we can structure transactions, but deploying that capital requires experts. And this is an unusual form of partnership. It's not typical for a bank historically to have partnered with an NGO. So they are helping us below water to figure out those places where the capital can deliver the best outcomes. And as you pointed out to a few, it is becoming, I think, much more well known and understood that mangroves as a natural capital solution in many locations are an incredible natural solution that does many things. On the one hand, they absorb sea storm surge. So when you have extreme weather events, they're far more effective at wave mitigation than perhaps a concrete barrier that, as it hits and hits and hits and it begins to degrade. And unfortunately, when it degrades, it's not healthy in the ocean. Mangroves are natural, so they absorb that sea stage. The other thing that they do is they serve as a part of an ecosystem. So plankton feed on mangroves and fish feed on the plankton, and it creates a very, very healthy system effect. And yet some of the mangroves have been, as part of often development, they might be taken away or dredged away in order to create, beaches or infrastructure. And rather than plant them back, then we put up a concrete solution. So it's this kind of a thing where there are very clear examples of where investing in nature works beautifully. And it's less about having to be in a position to see it underwater. It is to trust the scientists and conservationists who say when you invest in nature, its resiliency is quite remarkable. You do see real evidence of those investments in a fairly short period of time paying off quite dramatically. Nature protected areas, we see overfished areas where there's just nothing to catch anymore. You leave them alone for a few years and the stocks come back quite robustly. And then if you then have a managed fishing environment, a very carefully managed fishing environment, then it's a sustainable, sort of into perpetuity in terms of its ability to feed again and be healthy again. So there's lots there to talk about, coral restoration. There's so many places where we could go with this, but the beautiful thing is that there are plenty of places to put that money to work.
I'm so fascinated about your breadth of knowledge and obviously expertise, long time. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey to where you have been, to where you are now? So how did you end up as a CSO at SC?
Sure. Well, if I take a perspective of looking back slightly and trying to make sense of a pretty long career, I've been in the business nearly 40 years. If I were to put it in short form terms, when I started my career, what really I absolutely found fascinating and loved was financing industries that were early stage high growth. I just got an absolute joy out of that because I felt like I had a real part in developing something that really mattered. And at the time, that was through the provision of really important, I call it lifeblood capital at the early stage of those businesses' life cycles. And if I fast forward now nearly 40 years, I've come back almost full circle to be in a position where I'm financing the industries of the future. It's just that the industries of the future, we never thought about it 40 years ago, are going to be those sustainable industries and sustainable business models. Yeah. And so I get the same level of joy, except it's 10 times more purposeful because the lens of delivering impact while we're raising capital is not only building those enduring businesses, but you can see that by being very deliberate about the impact you're trying to create, you get to create those outcomes. So that's a little bit I'd say the look back of the cycle of my journey, but how to practically come into sustainability. I have to say I was very fortunate that I had a forward-thinking CEO at my former bank who saw this. Well, he couldn't articulate it in the way we do today as sustainability as a business function or CSO for that matter. There weren't CSOs back then in any material way for a bank anyhow. He could see the developing trends of the desire to link capital with outcomes, impact outcomes. He was seeing it and feeling that undercurrent of this desire of people to link those two. And he plucked me out of a very traditional banking job, which was I was looking after investment banking and capital markets for Europe for my former bank. And that was part of a long, very linear career, sort of growing up from being a young banker all the way through to running a big business and saying, this is something that I'd like you to consider running. And there wasn't a thing there at the time. It was just an idea. And it took a little convincing and it took a little research on my part to understand, really embrace what the message was behind this as being a very strategic opportunity for my bank. But when I did embrace it, there was a moment for me where I saw this as being the next phase of my career and one that would be incredibly rewarding, but also one where I could take the cumulative expertise over many years of being in finance and capital markets and apply it in a different way.
Fascinating, especially if it's such a long-term career. But in the end, maybe or towards having the stage then to somebody pushes you to the right direction. What are maybe some of the characteristics that you think the role of the CSO needs or is positive? Somebody says, or there was a white paper, I think, where it says Chief Sustainability Orchestrator. So kind of running around with all the different violins and the pianos and so on. What is the role of the CSO is for you?
Sure, Harald. It's a great question because this is not a traditional job function in a large corporate or a bank from a historical look back point of view. So in some ways, the job tends to reflect the person who holds the seat. On the other hand, there are a number of characteristics that I think you'd need. I think of this role and my function as a change agent or a transformation function. So we are agitating for change, pushing the organization or agitating for the organization to head in a direction. And therefore, when you think about it in that context, I don't have 85,000 people reporting to me. So it isn't command and control. We need to bring people along through influence and making, the positive business case, or why does the case work for them. So need, I think in some respects, the ability to articulate the vision and bring people along, but equally you have to have a thick skin, because you are trying to bump up against very traditional businesses and often push them ahead of the speed at which they're ready to go, and that requires constant, cajoling and making the business case, and in some cases really upskilling. Having the rest of the organization understand and learn and be able to articulate and then be the ambassadors for the business. So as I seek to embed sustainable finance across the organization, I can't expect that 85,000 of my brethren will be sustainable finance experts, but they need to be facile enough with this idea and our products and services so they can then engage with clients on the topic. So I think most CSOs tend to be able to be nimble, because none of this has ever been done before. So often you're pivoting as the ecosystem changes or opportunities present themselves. I think you have to have a thick skin. But probably the most important thing, as I see the way this role is heading, is in the past, if I were to look at the CVs of many of the CSOs, they might have come from the marketing area because they might have previously been writing CSR reports. Yeah. Or perhaps in a bank, they might have come from the risk function. So they were looking at, sustainability risks and climate risks. I think what we're seeing much more now and through the journey of learning is, if you believe that sustainability is fundamentally a strategic imperative for your organization, then having a CSO who's come from the business, I think, is an important element. Because first of all, it's signaling to the organization that it is strategic and core to the business, right in the front line of the business. But also, if you've come from the business, then you have the perspective of what's driving the business and what are the challenges and how to operate in that manner, but just with a sustainability lens. And so I think I count myself fortunate, having been in the business, to be in this role, because I think it'd be a lot harder if I weren't.
And so we had the back lens looking a little bit behind, but now let's look into the future. We know before this decade is out, we're not landing a man of the moon, but until 2030, we have a lot of things to do. There's a crucial point here. And as you mentioned, 2050. But how do you see the role of the CSO evolve maybe over the next couple of years? Also, given maybe the geopolitical systems where maybe 4 out of the next 5 years are somehow, there's an anchor kind of keeping us around or kind of pulling us back, but there's a lot of people, let's say, pulling forward. How do you see sustainability, nature, and the role of the CSO evolve in the future?
So I think the CSO, back to the, perhaps I say the thick skin, steady the course, because those of us who are in this role, I think, are in this role because we deeply, deeply believe in the necessity of what we're doing and the purpose of what we're doing. And the urgency is, as the timetables toward, fairly catastrophic tipping points get ever closer, the sense of urgency is higher and higher. So I think, the role of the CSO is continue to be a calm voice amongst perhaps what might be global divergence on this topic. And we are starting to see a geographic divergence, at least from a political leadership point of view, is to be very calm in the face of what is likely to be somewhat chaotic as all these chess pieces move around the political world. Be clear in your mission. Be very focused about what the objectives are in terms of the deliverables, and steady the course. And I think that's really, really important, because right now I find it frustrating because in some cases the journalistic community loves to write sensational headlines. And if you're susceptible to some of that, you can get very distracted by the noise. And yet facts underneath the headlines are quite clear. We know what the climate is telling us. We actually know the facts of how quickly economies are transitioning. I say this often, and anyone who's listening to podcasts who's heard me speak recently will know that this is my bugbear. But if you read the headlines, you believe electric vehicles are no longer It's the end of this transport sector. If you actually look at the numbers, they grew 36%, last year globally. And you go to certainly our economies and you can see the proliferation of the electrification really happening, scaling on the ground. And so I think it is also that being able to separate the noise from the fact, and then be able to drive your business toward where those opportunities are that you and your organization make a difference. How does a bank make a difference? Mobilizing capital at scale and allocating that capital sensibly and logically and carefully. And I think it's just, more of that is what we're going to need as the urgency kind of ramps up here. And then making sure we deliver on our commitments. As they say, steady the course and maintain true to that long-term ambition or intermediate-term ambition.
I have a closing question, and I always ask because we need to talk to new talent, young talents coming into the business. And if you look maybe as Marisa, a young Marisa who's looking at her career in either finance or let's say look of people who want to do impact, and they have choice to go either to an NGO, to go to do things in Africa, or join a corporate, or go to Greenpeace, or so there are so many roles. And for some of them to do impact, maybe the corporate role is the less likely because they think I cannot move a needle. What kind of tips would you give to young talent to explore where they can do maybe better impact or choose also a corporate route?
Sure. I absolutely firmly believe that there is no one answer. We need all of these types of stakeholders or actors to participate in sustainability. So therefore, I wouldn't say you get more impact if you're an NGO or if you're at a corporate. I think every role in society now, whether it's corporate or financial services, you have a role to play and you can deliver impact if you choose to be deliberate about it. So hopefully that's an optimistic message that I often say every job is a sustainability job in some respects. It doesn't matter whether you're legal or marketing or a corporate or a bank or an NGO. The actions that you take do have impact. And if you think about what do you want to achieve, and if you look at that through a sustainability lens, you could be in a legal profession working on documents that change the face of what is industry best practice. If you're in, another type of role, whatever those day-to-day aspects are, there is a sustainability lens of impact that you can deliver. So hopefully that encourages people to think that you incorporate this into whatever function that you end up in.
Thank you very much, Marisa. We're already at the end of this podcast. It's so fascinating to see passionate people like you driving the mission and being so knowledgeable of all the different details as well as the global scope. So thank you so much for your time and congratulations on your role, your mission, and everything you're doing on a very global scale. So kudos to you, Marisa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harald, and it's always lovely to be a part of your world too. And thank you for organizing our CSO community to help each other share best practices and keep on with our mission. So take care. Thank you.